what's going on?
Yeah,
I heard
yeah,
that there
okay,
is,
so-
and I quote, a huge W from Donald Trump.
That's not
I won't say
exactly
what person
what I
on the
said.
podcast said that exactly. Could have been anyone.
Who
That's not
said
what
that
I
off
said.
pod?
It
Yeah.
wasn't just his new mustache. I want to talk about Trump and bullying and trade. I've been pretty negative on his trade policy on this podcast thus far, in that I thought it's been pretty effective, pretty lackluster. But his general stance
pretty
is,
ineffective.
sorry, pretty ineffective. That's
Okay.
correct. Yeah, pretty ineffective and pretty damaging to America's trade partnerships and prestige and et cetera, and the dollar. However, the core philosophy of it, which is like America has the consumers of the world. We spend a lot of fucking money. You want to shop here, you got to pay my fee. This kind of like mafia style bullying that he's been doing has been mostly ineffective thus far. I want to say with yesterday's announcement of the EU trade deal, I think he got his first, in his mind, dub. The deal is so stacked in America's favor and so bad for Europe that it is impossible not to mention that his system in that way worked for this one. We have an across the board 50% tariff on all goods from Europe, and they have
50 or 15?
15.
15, okay.
And they have no tariff on us. Now, normally the problem with the trade war is you put tariffs on them, they put tariffs back on you, it escalates, it becomes this big problem, everyone gets poorer. But they have agreed to do nothing. They just bend over and take it, and they're going to buy more natural gas. They're going to invest money in America. This last part is pretty nebulous. Everyone says this, and it usually doesn't happen. But there's a 15% tariff on basically all European goods going in America.
Sorry, 15 or 50?
15%.
Okay, that's.
But on all goods.
You said 50 the first time, and I was like, that's a lot.
That'd be insane. No, 15, but none on American goods to Europe. And so, I looked into this, and this is pretty widely agreed. European sources, American sources, to be a very, very one-sided deal. It's interesting to think about that because Europe as a whole is economically about the same as America. Like they're roughly the same in terms of GDP output. It'd be like the China bloc, the EU bloc, and America bloc are roughly equally economic powerful. However, political power is much more difficult to find in Europe because they're fragmented. This is a negotiation by committee, and they kind of got picked apart, is basically the idea that I'm seeing. In that Trump went in very forcefully and kind of scarily, and they couldn't react fast enough. Now, Canada and China both reacted very forcefully. China responded immediately with counter tariffs. They banned rare earth metals. They did a lot of things to like muscle their way back in the conversation. Same with Canada, which did like American good boycotts and tariffs of their own. Europe was not able to move quickly, and they were very divided internally on how to respond, how forcefully. There's a block of like France and Spain that were like, we need to respond incredibly forcefully. We need to do huge tariffs on America. And then there's a block of like Germany and Italy that were like, if we get into a trade war, it's really scary for us. We have a lot of manufacturing exports. If they stop buying German cars or whatever, it's going to be terrible for our economy. And because of that, they ended up in a place where they took the easy out that was the less bad option. They took the 15% rather than maybe getting a 40 or 50 and getting into a trade war. So in this case, the bullying, at least in the short term, kind of worked in America's favor. And I want to it's a narrative violation a bit to what I've been talking about, but it's worth mentioning. That being said, the social ties, the political ties have deeply frayed. Like we're really making Europe an enemy, or like at least a sovereign bloc that is not tied in with America. But on trade, this deal is pretty bad for them.
I have questions.
Yeah.
So as it stands now, in the short term, seems not that good for Europe.
Yeah.
Good for the United States, right? Longer term, what are the consequences to us that you might have been reading about? Also longer term, what are the ways that Europe can make up for the shortfalls of this agreement? Like what you've talked about in the past, that decisions that the US is making and the aggression that the US is using towards Europe pushes them in potentially other directions in terms of who they work with more closely, like, whether it be China or they're more like interlocked in.
Yeah. Now, let me jump on that real quick because that is the big thing. I think that's what I might have gotten wrong in my earlier analysis, which is basically that my first take on this, which is that China's this rising power and this is going to push a lot of people into China's arms. What has actually happened in practice is that Europe has found itself between a rock and a hard place because they have a massive trade surplus with America. They make a lot of cars and goods and pharmaceuticals and they sell it to America. But they have a massive trade deficit with China. They can't run to China's arms because China is already dumping products on them. China's not buying enough European goods. So if they're like, all right, fuck America, we'll go to China, their manufacturing still is lost because China's outcompeting them.
They're getting outcompeted by the companies in China
Yes.
that are dominating the Chinese
That's
market
the problem.
already.
Like I wish I had a graph for you, but it's with America, it's this massive surplus for Europe, and they need that. That's their cut. That's what a lot of their jobs are, making things to sell in America. They don't have a lot of jobs making things to sell in China. In fact, they had a meeting with Xi Jinping and the Chinese delegation like 4 days ago, where Xi Jinping said, "I'm urging you to make the right choice, wink, in this upcoming trade." But like they were calling him out because the deficit between Europe and China has gotten so big that
They were calling him out. Europe was calling China out.
Von der Leyen, who did the EU negotiations with America, was calling China out and basically saying the deficit between Europe and China has gotten so big that we have to fix this gap.
They're saying, China, if you want to get what you want and for us to forge deeper ties, you need to do things that help us compete better in the Chinese market.
You have to buy more European stuff.
Yeah.
Like if we're going to buy a ton of Chinese stuff, you have to buy a bunch of European stuff, because right now it's very one-sided. Right now, China wants to manufacture for everyone in the world, and basically no one else has manufacturing jobs. They make it all. You buy from them. You get cheap goods, but you lose the jobs you had manufacturing.
Okay.
And Europe does not want to do that.
So this is the argument that I heard from Scott Bessent, who's the Treasury Secretary, who's basically the guy in the administration, Trump administration, who's leading this. And I remember listening to him when all this tariff stuff started, and his argument was it's a bad idea for any country in the world to threaten us because we buy everybody's stuff. We have the power here, right? Like China, this is the argument from him. Like China needs us because their economy right now is just based on manufacturing things and selling it. And we, as America, are the biggest buyer. And so we need them more than they need us. And it sounds like that's kind of what's going on with Europe as well. Or at least that's the argument in terms of being able to bully them into something.
I would say with China, it didn't work out the way he thought, in that China, first of all, I think was more ready for it. So they are still manufacturing for everyone outside of America, and they have found many, many ways to send it to Mexico or Vietnam or Cambodia, and it gets around it. So it hasn't really impacted them in the same way. Europe blinked, is how I've read from European and American sources. They were too scared of this escalating, and in the short term having like empty factories in Germany, and like they don't have that system set up. They're built for free trade with the United States, and they thought 15% tariff won't change the price enough that everyone switches to non-European goods. By the way, I do want to say very clearly, the data is now out. Who is paying the tariffs? It is still American consumers. Like 80% of the tariff is paid by American consumers paying higher prices. So it's not like it's a great thing for us. We're raising more money from tariffs. It's just less bad than it is for them.
So I was going to ask, when you look at this from an American perspective, is the main downside or the only downside that we have to pay more for European goods?
Yes.
But that's it.
That's the downside, yeah.
And what is the win from Trump's camp's perspective?
Tons of money raised from tariff revenue.
I.e. from Americans
paying Americans more. Paying more. It's like a VAT tax. And then over time, the idea is that extra tax is going to make European manufacturers less competitive to Americans, and we'll get some of that business.
Maybe a cascading bit of logic here, and jump in to correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding, goods from Europe are usually finished higher end products rather than things that are used to build or produce things, right? Like a lot of what we get from China or Canada might be timber or oil or minerals, right? Sure. Things that go into the base manufacturing of something else in the United States that you go on to make a house out of the timber, for example.
Sure.
But from Europe, you're buying more finished goods or higher end goods like BMWs.
Luxury goods, wine, pharmaceuticals, cars. Yeah, those are like their big.
So even though the prices are going up on those things, the impact to American businesses might also be lower because they're end consumer products that don't influence the cost of a bunch of things after the fact. Or do you not think that's true?
I see what you're saying, but I think economic theory would say that over time, like an American wine producer is going to have an advantage long-term over the European one if they have to pay 15%, if there's a 15% tariff that makes them more expensive. That should eventually happen. What Europe is gambling on is that 15% is not big enough to change anyone's buying habits. They'll just take this smaller tariff. It kind of sucks. Their prices are going to be more expensive, but the structure of global trade won't change. They still have their leadership in the industries they have in pharmaceuticals and all that. That's their idea. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out. Again, so far, outside of this deal, it hasn't really worked out on the Trump side for what they've said is going to happen. Like, one thing I really want to mention is that China and the rare earth metals thing was the ultimate knockout punch. Like that turned out to be a really strong negotiating position because they own almost the entire supply chain on rare earth metals. Until your company comes up. But For now, when they did that, Trump had to back down and change some things and soften because that cut off so much of American businesses that use rare earth metals to build things, and it all goes through China. Like once they cut that off, they had the balls in the vice. I heard someone describe it as.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Is that is there nothing like that is being imported from Europe that has equal stake in terms of security or underlying economic value to American businesses? Is that part of the reason why this decision can get made?
No, I think the thing that Europe had in its quiver they could have used was that trade between America and Europe is actually more balanced than Trump says it is, but they buy services. They do a lot of digital services. Basically, our big tech dominates Europe. And so a lot of money from there flows us, but doesn't count as a goods trade, so that's why we have a deficit. They have rules they created after Trump won for this situation where they can really crack down on American big tech. And they thought about using them, and France was saying to use them. They decided not to because they didn't want to escalate this trade war.
What
they
is
blinked.
the employment of that would be something like, I have a Salesforce contract with a company in France and they can add a tax to that contract?
Yeah, something like that. Or, they could put a tax on Google AdSense or antitrust regulate Meta and Instagram, or they could really make big tech's life hell in Europe. And if they did that, the threat would be that is going to, that's the 7 stocks holding up America. If we really hammer big tech, it's going to fuck your stock market. And so they considered it. It was a serious thing, but they got afraid. They blinked. And whether it's the right call or not remains to be seen. Some people say this was the smart choice. Tariffs are paid by Americans. They can deal with the problem. We'll hold steady and get American goods for cheaper. I'm just saying, this is the first time someone's got truly bullied with no response. And they're saying that, not just us. European diplomats are saying we got rolled over, we got steamrolled. France is saying this is submission. We're agreeing to submission right now. This is what's happening. And so I don't know what it'll mean going forward. It's definitely a fraying of the relationship. But if this deal is signed and holds, it's a win for America on trade versus Europe. Yeah.
This could be tough because I do love making fun of Europeans.
Let's cap this out with a quick test. See if this whole thing that Trump's doing worked. Aiden, will you finally start manufacturing Ludwig's merchandise here in America?
No. No, it wasn't really getting made.
You weren't making it in France.
It was only getting made in Europe sometimes. Yeah. Some things sometimes get made in Portugal. It might change that a little bit, but it's not going to move it to America.
You're not going to finally open up a factory? Do you hate America?
I mean...
You're the one going to sleep, bro.